So here we are in the book of Ezra, and we're in Judah, and more specifically in Jerusalem. There have been two groups of exiles that were taken into Babylonian captivity that have returned to the land. They started out by rebuilding the altar for sacrifice. Then they built the temple, and then they built the walls. When Ezra went back with the second group of people that had been in exile, he found something disturbing. It's found in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. And for a lot of folks, they'll find that the resolution to this problem was also disturbing because today this is a hot topic amongst Christians and amongst the Christian world. So let's take a look at Ezra chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, the problem that existed in the land of Judah, and more specifically in Jerusalem, amongst the Israelites that had returned from captivity. Now, when these things had been completed, the princes approached me, saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands, according to their abominations, those of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters and as wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race has been intermingled with the peoples of the land. Indeed, the hands of the princes and the rulers have been foremost in this unfaithfulness. So here's what had happened. The people had come back from captivity. There were many of these people, Amorites, Ammonites, and Jebusites, and so on, living in the land. And the people of Israel had intermarried with them. What's worse than that is it was the spiritual leaders and the leaders of the nation of Israel that had done it the foremost, that is the most. And as a result, Ezra was very troubled. Now, it's very important for you to understand the magnitude or lack of magnitude in this. We know that roughly 50,000 people came back to the land. When they did their examination of this, the number of people that had intermarried was not a huge number, but it was significant enough that as you look at verses 5 through 7 in chapter 9, Ezra was very upset, very much apologetic to God about what had happened. We today would call this unequally yoked. That is, a believer and a non-believer marrying each other, and that's exactly what was happening here. There were people who were practicing Judaism, and they had married people that were pagans that didn't believe in Judaism, probably worship false idols. So Ezra was very concerned, and he did as Ezra has done so many times before. He talked to God first about man before he talked to man about God. So he studied carefully what would have happened here, went to God. In verses 8 and 9, it tells us very clearly that he acknowledged before God this intermarriage situation, apologized and confessed to God about the problem. More than that, he seems to have, in verses 10 through 15, asked for God's guidance, and God sent him guidance through a man that would give him some wisdom as to what needed to be done in this situation. So let's take a look. In chapter 10, Shechaniah proposes that the people make a covenant with God and that they do away with these unequally yoked marriages. That is, that each of the Levites and the priests and all of the laity that had intermarried divorce their wives and also separate themselves from those wives and children. Now, that sounds pretty harsh, but if you look carefully at that, you'll find that it clearly says in chapter 10, verse 3, they did it according to the law. Now let's think about that for a minute. What was the law? The law was that they not be unequally yoked. And here that leaves room for those who had been brought into the Jewish faith that had come into the marriages. And it also gave room for those who had chosen to follow the religious beliefs of the ones that they had married, not the pagan ones, but the pagans who had chosen to follow the Israeli belief in Judaism. So there's certainly good law here. The other thing is that it'd be a very proper separation of their unions, and that not just be cast out. Now, what's very interesting about this is they set up some leaders to investigate carefully each and every situation of this unequally yoked. They took 3 months, and at the end of 3 months, they found out that 17 priests, 6 Levites, 1 singer, and 3 porters, and 86 lay people had intermarried. Now, when you consider the thousands of people that had come back into the land, that's not a huge number. Nevertheless, it was enough to concern Ezra because it set an example, especially since 17 priests and 6 Levites had done this, which were the example to the community. So they took this 3 months, they investigated carefully, and then they published, as you'll see in chapter 10, published a list of all of those who had violated the Hebrew rules of not intermarrying with pagans. And the people made a covenant with God that they would go ahead and divorce their wives and separate from the wives and children according to the law. Now, what it doesn't tell us is whether or not they gave these people a chance, the wives and the children, to convert to Judaism so that they wouldn't have to be divorced. But we would think that because it took 3 months, that would be a logical conclusion, that there was not only justice here, but there was mercy. There was an opportunity to rectify the marriage situation so that they had the same faith. Now, if you really want to look at this carefully, you really need to take a look at some additional scriptures. You need to look at Malachi chapter 2, verse 6. And you need to look at 2 Corinthians 6:14 and Matthew 19, 4 through 6, because it all deals with today's unequally yoked. I don't think we have to be Rhodes Scholars in order to understand that an unequally yoked marriage is a bad thing. Not only is it a bad thing that the one that is not a believer might draw away the one that is a believer, but it's also a bad example when the leadership is doing this. And so there's some real interesting applications for us here from the Old Testament, long before the New Testament was written, and long before we understood Jesus' teaching and the Bible's teaching on being unequally yoked with a non-believer. The first one is that leaders do set an example. And it's one of the reasons that Baptists and other denominations are struggling with this issue of divorce and remarriage and being unequally yoked, because leaders do set an example. The second application that we can see here is very clear in verses 16 through 17, and that is any kind of church action should require a very extensive and careful investigation. Let me say that again. Any church action should take a very careful investigation, and to be careful to be sure that everything is done according to what is right and what the law is. And so we see a good example there that we need to apply to our lives about investigations. However, we also need to look at the justice of this. Forever recorded in history in Ezra chapter 10 are the names of those who had gone outside of their own faith and intermarried with pagans in the land. That is pretty big warning to all of us that when we do something that's improper and church action is required, and obviously it's not settled the issue, that is, those that have gone astray, have not corrected their conduct, that their names will be known for that. And they are here in the scriptures. And finally and thirdly, I think it's very important that we look at the fact that this was done totally according to the law and took 3 months, and there weren't that many cases to have to deal with. And therefore, I think it's very appropriate for us to realize that these families were given an opportunity to correct the situation without divorce. Let me say that again. It's quite clear to me with 3 months and the small number of these situations that these families were given an adequate opportunity to correct the situation and to get the marriage in the right stand. And that's my thought for the day. God bless you. Have a great day.